I'm Jeff Asher, and this is the Jeff-alytics podcast. New Orleans has spent years cycling through crime narratives without much agreement on what success is supposed to look like. In the middle of that tension sits the prosecutor's office, forced to choose between political pressure and judicial fairness. In this episode, I'm joined by Jason Williams, the Orleans Parish District Attorney, to talk through how his office approaches public safety when data, history, and public opinion are all pulling in different directions. Jason explains how data informs his office's decisions, laying out the thinking behind programs like the No-Dice program to interrupt crime before it escalates. Our conversation digs into how Louisiana's shameful judicial history shapes the way his office operates, the difference between pursuing justice and chasing convictions, and the challenge of improving safety while navigating state and federal interventions. Jason is clear that incarceration on its own is not a strategy and that progress depends on constant reassessment. This episode offers a ground-level view of what it means to run a prosecutor's office with both accountability and outcomes in mind. My guest today is the incomparable Jason Williams, District Attorney of the City of New Orleans, or Orleans Parish. Jason, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Jeff, it's good to be with you.
So I'm going to dive right in. I'm honoring your background today with my 2025 American Football Conference Tulane Green Wave Champions t-shirt. Walk me through your background here.
As you know, because you have a father who also donned a Green Wave helmet, that we have not always had winning seasons, right? So we know what it's like to be an underdog. I played football there. I know what it's like to go up against just unimaginable odds because of that experience. You know, beyond that, I did go to law school. I was a defense attorney for a couple of decades. I left that work to become a city council member, to engage in policy that I thought would improve quality of life in a number of different areas, the city council. And in 2020, I ran for DA. And as you know, in each of those spaces, I believe that that we should let data drive our decision making as opposed to sort of just anecdotally doing what we think feels right. Feelings will get you killed in a war field and they don't really help you in municipal government. And so we've tried to rely on data to get better outcomes, whether it was in the city council level or whether it was in the criminal justice system. I did serve as a judge in 2003 at criminal district court, one of the youngest judges to have been appointed, which gave me a very different perspective in terms of the amount of time and money and resources that were spent in a day in court, just looking at it from the angle of the bench. But right now, you know, we are sort of ground zero for mass incarceration, ground zero for what the war on drugs looked like, and ground zero for exonerations. Frankly, I think we are now ground zero for using data to drive policy.
So speaking to that, how do you kind of balance the need to, and you almost immediately dealt with some of the worst crimes, the worst stretch of murder that New Orleans had ever had or had had in decades in 2022, just shortly into your term. So you have to kind of balance that. How do you balance that with your office's general history and the city's general history of improper prosecutions, mass incarcerations, the need to get exonerations? How do you sort of mix those two?
I think it's important to have historical context. Being a New Orleanian, I realized that 2022 was not our first time being the murder capital of the country. We have had that unenviable moniker and label at multiple times throughout our recent history. And if you look at the 80s, parts of the 90s, we have been the murder capital of this country while still having the highest incarceration rate, while still having some of the highest conviction rates and also having the highest exoneration rates. So when you look at it over the course of 40 years, I'm 53, you can see that the so-called tough on crime policies that have existed throughout the years, the idea that you prosecute everyone for every crime and you give them as much time as you can for every crime, that was not making New Orleans a safer place. That was not reducing the number of shootings. That wasn't reducing the use of illicit drugs. And so we realized that a smart on crime approach could yield better results. And so being the murder capital of the world at the beginning of my term, at a time when we also were dealing with COVID-19, which shut down our courts longer than any other jurisdiction in the country, we began to really get very specific and granular about the crimes we would target. And we targeted violent crimes, carjackings, murder, rape, armed robbery. And we built specialized units that allowed the lawyers and trial teams and investigators to build muscle memory for specific types of cases, which helped us get to the point where we are now, where we've got some of the best jury verdict rates when it comes to homicides. And so, looking at New Orleans as being a national outlier and Louisiana being a national outlier as it relates to over-incarceration, wrongfully convicted persons, we thought that shifting this sort of tough on crime approach to a smarter on crime approach that dealt with data, that dealt with using technology as force multipliers to make our prosecutions more accurate so that jurors would agree with our theory of the case, because we were bringing more digital evidence that people tend to look for. Not only were we looking backwards at correcting the sins of the past and dealing with the day job of current cases, we were trying to do that better by using technology there as well, because it's not enough just to make the system more fair. The system still needs to function effectively and accurately.
Can you talk me through, to that end, No-Dice? I'm, I guess, leading the witness here, as a prosecutor may say, but it's one of my favorite programs because it's so obvious and it's so silly that it hasn't existed, and yet now it does exist. And I think it's such a great thing that your office has sort of led the way with this. So can you talk through that program and how it approaches things and how it's kind of contributing to the bigger picture declines that we're seeing in New Orleans?
I'm going to start by echoing your point. We already knew this needed to be done. It was just the political will and the resources to focus on it. My wife's in education. There's a writer who basically says, we know everything we need to do to get the best out of young people. We just need, as adults, to have the will to execute on those things, right? So No-Dice is a program that focuses on data. It looks at root causes. It uses heat maps to look at crime trends so we can see the types of crimes happening in certain parts of the city. And we use that map to decide our focus and our priority of our very limited resources. A homicide, obviously that is a specific case involving specific people, but you also have place-based crimes. It might be a derelict apartment complex. It might be a 24-hour tire shop where illicit drugs or illegal guns are sold. It might be a corner grocery store that is dealing in more than groceries, but dealing in drug activity and gun activity. And so these places become hubs of criminality. And so what No-Dice does is it's a carrot and stick approach. Not only do you have the stick, arrest, investigation, and prosecution, you also have the carrot, which is what needs to happen in that community, in those 5 or 6 blocks, to help reduce crime. I think Desmond Tutu said it best when he says, there comes a time when you can't just keep pulling bodies out of the river. You have to go upstream and figure out why they're falling in the first place. And so No-Dice, working with Andre Godin on my team and Daniel Shanks, who was director of this initiative, these folks would work with municipal departments. It might be Parks and Parkways. It might be the director of homeless services, along with ATF, along with all the other place-based departments in city government, so that not only do we remove the bad actors from the community, we also improve streetlights. It might be pressure washing the space. It might be removing a homeless encampment, but also getting those people housed so they don't come back into the community. And then there's a component that we bring to the table using the padlock ordinance and other new municipal laws to shut down the problematic place so that we remove the hub of criminality. We close the void that typically gets refilled if you just remove those bad actors. I mean, anybody who saw The Wire knows if you arrest 10 people, 10 more people will take their place before those other people get properly booked. So you've got to have a holistic approach to it. And I believe No-Dice very clearly did that, but we did it with community. So we had members of the community, whether it be faith-based leaders, neighbors, neighborhood organizations. They were sort of guiding the ship, telling us what the problems were in their community. And then government got together and create a coordinated strategy to improve life on the ground for the people that lived in that community. And it's very specific. It might be 5 blocks. It might be 10 blocks. When you work with specificity like that, you can drastically improve the quality of life in that area and has a very real ripple impact on the rest of the community, the same way that crime was having that ripple impact on the rest of that community.
The thing I think that sticks out with me with No.Dice is, or just generally the place-based approach is, and as you know, I've been analyzing New Orleans crime for, almost 15 years. And if you look at the maps of where violence is occurring now, and you compare that to where it was in the 90s, they're basically the same maps. And so it's crazy the degree to which the stickiness of violence in New Orleans has persisted. And, if you can fix a handful of blocks, you can have an outsized effect. So I think it's a brilliant approach. When you try to balance a city where your actions as the chief prosecutor can be seen as both, the same action can be seen as both too harsh and too lenient, depending on who the audience is or who's viewing it. How do you try to balance that? Is there a predetermined set of tasks of ways that you're going to approach it? Or is it just, I'm going to do what's right and let the chips fall where they may?
The chips are going to fall with some people hating the decision you made and some people loving the decision you made. There really is not a lot of neutrality in this work because it's not, again, based on feeling. It's based on fact and evidence, and we've got to follow the facts and evidence. If the facts and evidence suggest that some police officer cheated and engaged in unconstitutional activities that led to the arrest of an innocent or guilty man 20 years ago, we are obligated to bring that information to light in court. Justice has to be that goal. And, justice sometimes leads to a conviction. Sometimes justice leads to an exoneration. Sometimes justice leads a case to be tried in court. Sometimes it leads to a dismissal or a plea bargain. Very recently, we had a very difficult case involving the death of an infant, and the case was presented as a baby shaking case. But as the scientific evidence presented itself and as it was being vetted, it was clear that there was a genetic disorder that more probably led to the demise of this young child, not unexplained trauma caused by a parent. And that case had to be dismissed. The science guided that process. It wasn't gut feeling. It wasn't emotional. We have that challenge. We have that burden. The burden of proof is high on us because we can take away a person's freedom. And in this state, we can take away a person's freedom for their natural life, which is very different from other jurisdictions. And so, like commercial airplane pilots, we really need to get it right. If a Delta pilot says, I only crash 5% of the planes I fly, he's not going to have a very stellar career.
Very short one. Do you have a trick for basically describing, one, the actions of your office, and two, just sort of the general crime trends that we're seeing in the city? People tend not to believe that things are getting better or getting worse when they are. I feel like maybe with New Orleans, people tend to maybe perceive it a little bit better than elsewhere. But do you have tricks for saying, hey, this is what we're doing and this is how it's leading to better outcomes?
Number one, people like you who talk about crime in terms of measuring outcomes is a very big part of the work that we do. When crime was high, we were measuring it the same way we're measuring it when crime is low. People are very skeptical about everything now, as you know. Getting people to agree on anything or believe what they see on their nightly news is very, very difficult. So I think it's really important to always share data, share information. We have been using public-facing dashboards since I was elected. We use them on the city council level to measure rates of COVID. We use them to measure incarceration, and we're using them now to show outcomes, whether it's conviction rates, whether it's arrest to solve rates, because people don't want to just rely on the words of the elected or the words of individuals. They want to see it for themselves. And I think being able to share that with them is very, very helpful. We also like to share outcomes publicly when there's been a jury trial or when there's been a plea. If the news covered the story when a horrific thing happened, we think it's really important that there's a bookend on that so that the public can understand what was the resolution of that thing that took so much of their heart and headspace in 2022, right? Whether it's the Linda Fricky case or the Joseph Washington case, being able to hear the outcomes, we believe is another way to show those measurable results. When you talk about the exonerations, the folks who were in jail, whether it was non-unanimous juries, whether it was forgotten men were a group of men who were supposed to serve a certain period of time, but then the legislature changed and they ended up serving life sentences, and they agreed to these reduced sentence before America had put a man on the moon. And then it all changed and they found themselves languishing in jail. And so when people are released or exonerated, we measure recidivism rates, right? So when people start talking about this so-called revolving door or suggesting that correcting the sins of the past and allowing innocent or wrongfully convicted men and women to come home, when they suggest that's going to cause crime to spike, we want to measure those folks and be able to show these folks have not committed new crimes. They have jobs and they're working. And so having those data points, I think, has been really, really important for the public to, one, understand that they are safer than they were 3 years ago. There are fewer incidents of crime. There's a higher conviction rate than ever before. And there's a better solve rate by the police department. All these things mean very different things. But if we don't talk about them in very specific ways, they get sort of blended together. People think the solve rate by detectives for homicides is the same thing as conviction rate. And they're not. But we have to talk apples to apples every single chance we get.
Can you talk through non-unanimous juries? I know you mentioned it, and I know a lot of people that maybe aren't from the New Orleans area or the Louisiana area may not understand what a big deal it is to be addressing those. So can you talk through that?
Sure. So outside of two states, Louisiana and Oregon, every other state required 12 out of 12 jurors to agree on the verdict. However, in Oregon, and for their own reasons, and in Louisiana, the Deep South, there was a constitutional convention in the late 1800s in which was sort of right in the middle of crushing Reconstruction and redefining the South, when there was a fear that blacks would get onto a jury and the system would not be able to convict as easily as it could before. And the language in the writing of the non-unanimous jury vehicle actually said, for the preservation of the white race. It was written out, right? So it's very clear that this was a Jim Crow era piece of legislation designed to marginalize and quiet the voices of one part of the population, the recently freed part of the population. And so just before I was elected, Republicans and Democrats, blacks and whites alike throughout the state came together and decided this is wrong. We need to fix it. And we did. We overwhelmingly came into the modern era, replaced a broken Jim Crow era law, and required unanimity. 12 out of 12 jurors have to agree on guilt. Now, what that meant was there were a number of cases that had been decided. Will Smith's person who killed Will Smith, Cordell Hayes, was one of the cases that had been tried recently, along with a host of others where there were not 12 jurors that agreed on the verdict. And those cases fell into this area that meant these defendants, based upon the Supreme Court's ruling on unanimous juries, deserved a new trial. And so it meant that there's a lot more work on this office. We had to go back and retry cases that had 10-2 verdicts or 11-1 verdicts. And in a lot of those instances, those juries would have voted 12 out of 12 had they had more time, had that had been the requirement. But the law required us to try those cases again. So that inorganically inflated our caseload at a time when crime was already high. We also reviewed a number of cases where there was evidence that there might have been a racial bias or issues in the case. Jermaine Hudson comes to mind as a case that was a non-unanimous jury cases that we were reviewing in all 12 sections of court to make sure that there were not other legal defects in those convictions. And in a number of those cases, men and women were prepared to plead guilty to a crime to avoid being retried. Jermaine Hudson was one of those individuals who in Section G was preparing to plead guilty because he would have pled guilty to a lesser offense and would have come home after serving about 22 years of a 60-year sentence. A week or so before he was scheduled to be back in court, the purported victim of the case came to my office and said, I lied 22 years ago. I was not the victim of an armed robbery. In fact, there was no armed robbery. My father asked where the money was from my work that day. He had used it to buy drugs. He didn't want to tell his dad he had used it to buy drugs. He told his dad he was robbed. His dad called the police. He picked a random person out. That random person turned out to be Jermaine Hudson. Jermaine Hudson maintained his innocence throughout the trial. He was convicted of that crime, and he served 22 years for a crime that never occurred. But investigating and dealing with those non-unanimous jury cases allowed us to get inside of that case, to vet what occurred, and allowed us to correct a crime against Mr. Hudson, frankly.
Is there any part of you that sort of Jason Williams, the prosecutor, has to deal with all of these cases that says, oh, I wish it was the easier way, that we'd have a better winning record if we could go 12-0? Or is it, it's okay for us to lose as long as we did everything fairly and the justice is served?
I don't think there's anything in the law or in the oath that I took that says I should always win. I think that's when ego gets involved and hubris gets involved. We present cases to juries and judges, and they decide. They grade our paper. Obviously, it does make our job exponentially harder. But I campaign. I've got a sign over there, yes on 2, encouraging people to vote for unanimity in the jury trial process. It's the right thing. I think justice always has to be the goal. Whether that means our job over here on South White Street is harder, then it just has to be harder. It shouldn't be easy to take a person's liberty. That's why we use words like burden of proof, phrases like burden of proof. And the phrase burden in and of itself means that we willingly accept a very, very extraordinary responsibility and obligation.
Speaking of things that are sort of hard to balance, how have you dealt with potential incursions, both from the state and the federal level over the last couple of years that may not be the most welcome or maybe hard to kind of deal with or handle with local population that may not love them? Is there any trick to that? Because I think you've certainly been at the forefront of trying to do that.
It has been unceasing and unrelenting, and it is certainly part of the job that I don't think I was expecting. I thought we would be focused on what was happening in court, our outcomes in court. I was not expecting there to be a fight for states' rights in some states and a fight to protect the autonomy and control of an office that I was elected to. I wasn't expecting our municipal leaders, mayor, city council, to take on the heat and venom that they sometimes get from the state and sometimes from the federal government. It's difficult because, people are so distracted today, whether it's a phone, whether it's life, whether it's the 24-hour news cycle. It's hard for people to keep track of what's happening. And, whether it is the National Guard, whether it's ICE, whether it is some right-wing push to control the body autonomy of women when it comes to reproductive rights. There appears to be an unending needle to thread, whether it's coming from the state or whether it's coming from federal government. It certainly is, I won't call it distracting because we have managed to remain focused on what's important, but it does make everything a whole lot harder than it should. I really do believe that criminal justice system and public safety, those are spaces that should be immune from partisan politics. Murder, rape, armed robbery, they're wrong. We all agree, right? We should all be on the same page with regards to those things. And if there's a desire to change things, it should happen at the state legislature.
So one of the thoughts that I've been having that I think is the challenge, murder nationally is probably at the lowest rate it's been in a long time. Locally in New Orleans in 2025 probably had the fewest murders since 1970, roughly. And, extremely low carjacking rates, low vehicle burglaries, auto thefts, which were comically high at one point a few years ago, have fallen a massive amount. So as the analyst, we've sort of taken this narrative of everything is the worst, everything has gotten really bad. And now we've swung to the other pendulum of everything has gotten significantly worse, even historically better. How do we responsibly talk about these issues when the pendulum starts to swing the other way? We're not going to hit zero murders. At some point, we're going to see a rise in murder locally and nationally. What is the best way to start communicating that narrative that doesn't give credence to the idea that, oh, now we need massive crackdowns and huge mandatory minimum sentences and take everything all the way to the other end?
If we talk about things granularly and in terms of, if we're just accurate, our success and our trending down in all areas of crime occurred when we had a Democrat as governor and when we had a Republican as governor. We were already trending this direction. When we had a Democrat in the White House, we had a Republican in the White House. New Orleans was already trending in the right direction. And we were not using draconian, militaristic, longer sentences in order to reach those trends. There was more collaboration, state, local, federal. There was specificity. There were particularized units, special units that were focused on certain types of crime. It also comes on the heels of the decriminalization of marijuana municipally, which occurred when I was at the city council, right? So we've got to look at so the war on drugs that we live with in the 80s and 90s was not a part of this piece, right? And so if we're specific, we'll focus on those strategies that brought us success, and we'll lock in on those. And the things that kept us at neutral or failed, we'll regroup and try to add new ones. That goes to say, yeah, there were national trends going the same direction. I think New Orleans brought crime down faster and at a steeper amount sooner than other places. But I think we've got to be very, very careful about the waving of victory flags in the space of public safety. Now is not a point for any one agency, my agency, police department, governor. It's not the time to wave a victory flag. It's a time for us to do an assessment of how we got to this point, refine those strategies, find new strategies, new force multipliers, and set audacious goals for ourselves to move forward. The goal I would set would say, okay, it's great. We're not the murder capital of the country anymore. Well, let's get out of the top 5. As New Orleans is a small enough city, population-wise, geographically, we have enough collaboration and strategic initiatives in place that we could scale these things out to say, what do we want to do to take ourselves out of the top 5? And then once we get out of the top 5, let's set another goal for a date certain in the future. Maybe it's 5 years from now. How do we get out of the top 10? And then once we get out of that, set another goal for how to get out of the top 20. And I think treating crime, treating public safety scientifically and strategically rather than anecdotally, waving success flag when numbers are great and then pointing fingers when numbers are bad. I think we can set ourselves up to really be the blueprint for American cities because, Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, these are big places. It's hard to put a strategy in place and see the impact of that strategy as fast as you saw the impact of no-dice in the Treme, of no-dice in the lower Ninth Ward. I think we are just the right size to set goals and meet those goals so that we don't find ourselves stuck in the sort of secular trends that we've seen in the past.
I love it. Yeah. And to your answer, I think one of the things that has always stuck out with me, I think when we built the jail dashboard when you were at the city council, was how much the incarcerated population fell and how little impact that had on the murder rate. And that over 15 years or 10 years, the murder rate went up and down. And yet yeah, almost to a T, every year the city's incarceration population went from 3,500 people to 1,000 people.
That's a big data point. You would think that would be something that books are written about or something that there'd be a number of headlines on. But incarceration does not equal safety, right? I mean, that has been proven through your work and a number of other initiatives. When you look at what our jail size was and what our crime rates were, those things do not correlate in the way that we've been telling ourselves for a few decades.
So I'm going to put you on the spot for the last question. As an elected official in the city of New Orleans, what is the most entertaining thing that has happened to you? If you want to expand it, you can, but this can be safe for work as well.
It's a safe space, but it's recorded, Jeff. You know, entertaining is the wrong word, but I mean, I guess a lot of people look at, horror films as entertaining, but I think the most entertaining thing I've experienced as an elected official was hearing a very prominent person claim that 2 weeks of National Guard troops resulted in the crime rate and what we're experiencing in New Orleans right now.
We won't name that person, but keep them safe in this space. Thank you. What's next for the office?
So we are, in the words of Rahm Emanuel, you're never to waste a crisis, right? This last administration has left the city in a situation where there appears to be well over $100 million deficit that we've got to deal with. That's going to impact everything from whether or not streets get repaired, street lights are operating, whether or not we have enough lawyers in the courtroom and enough police officers in the street. So what's next for this office is trying to figure out a way that we don't backslide, that the criminal justice system does not backslide because of this financial deficit. We are working with a group called Bancroft Global to really do a top to bottom audit throughout our entire office, looking at personnel, staff, workflows to find how we can be more efficient in delivering what we need to deliver, because we do realize that we're going to have to tighten our belt the same way that City Hall is tightening up its belt. And we're hoping to do this in a way that allows us to not remain stagnant in terms of our public safety numbers, but to continue to improve. Michael Harrison and Daniel Shanks, who have worked with our No.I.C.E program, are going to be working with the new administration. The collective vision is that a lot of the good things that we were able to accomplish with No.I.C.E will scale out and become an entire citywide strategy about improving quality of life in more communities at once. And so we're just trying to really figure out a way to work smarter moving forward to continue with the gains we've made. When I say it's never a good time to wave a victory flag, we also need to pinpoint the things that we're not doing well. And we're focusing on the things that the city continues to struggle with, which is reducing the amounts of domestic violence in this community, not just the things that turn out fatal, but all incidences of domestic violence. We've endeavored to work with the police department so that we could try to provide some, or at least pinpoint trauma services for young people who were present at violent crime scenes so that their teachers and administrators know that they went through a traumatic experience, so that there can be intervention in their lives so that we're not creating more violent adults. And sexual violence against women and children. Those are areas that have not trended down at the same rate as the shooting rate, the carjacking rate, the armed robbery rate. And so we want to focus on those areas. Jimmy Carter said that violence against women and children is probably the biggest atrocity in America years ago, and it still is. And so we are recommitting ourselves to the areas that we have not had the success in that we want, so that we can improve in those areas as well.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it, and keep up the great work.
You too, Jeff. Thank you.
And roll wave.
Roll wave. Happy New Year, brother.
Happy New Year. Happy Mardi Gras. Thanks for listening to the Jeff-alytics podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and to learn more, head on over to ahdatalytics.com for more information and previous episodes. If you like what you heard, please leave a glowing review, which will help others to discover the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Asher.